They say absolute power corrupts, but for Alistair Montgomery, it terrified. He built an empire in the shadows of modern Manhattan to hide his monstrous hunger. He was a king terrified of his own crown. Then a blind archivist with a voice like spun gold walked into his forbidden sanctuary. Alistair Montgomery did not drink blood from crystal goblets, nor did he attend lavish moonlit galas. For the past century, the undisputed king of the North American vampire factions lived in a state of absolute, self-imposed quarantine. From the penthouse of the Montgomery Tower, a glittering needle of glass and steel piercing the New York City skyline, he ruled an invisible empire. He was a creature of immense, terrifying power, a power that had long ago stopped being a gift and had become a terminal disease. Among his kind, it was called the Bleeding Frost. It was a rare mutation of the vampiric condition, an overflow of supernatural energy that occurred when a vampire grew too old, too strong, and too detached from their dormant humanity. When Alistair experienced heightened emotions, anger, hunger, or even profound sorrow, his body became a localized weapon of mass destruction. The ambient temperature around him would plummet to absolute zero. The air would physically shatter, and any living thing within a 50-foot radius would have the life force ripped from their veins, leaving behind only desiccated frozen husks. He had learned this the hard way in 1923, leaving a trail of unspeakable tragedy in a Parisian theatre. Since that night, he had locked himself away. His corporate empire was run by Alex Penhaligon, his loyal right hand, and a vampire of a younger, more stable lineage. Alex handled the board meetings, the acquisitions, and the brutal politics of the supernatural underworld. To the human world, Alistair Montgomery was a reclusive billionaire eccentric. To the vampire world, he was a mythic god of death, too dangerous to approach, too powerful to overthrow. He spent his nights wandering the hermetically sealed, lead-lined corridors of his penthouse, starved for connection, but paralyzed by the fear of his own lethality. He was a king imprisoned by his own crown, slowly going mad in the silence. That silence was broken by the arrival of Isla Harrington. The Montgomery Foundation had recently acquired a priceless collection of medieval texts, crumbling, fragile grimoires that required an expert's touch. Alex, always pragmatic, hired the best antiquarian restorer from the British Museum. What Alex failed to mention in his meticulous dossiers was that Isla was legally blind. Diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa in her early 20s, her vision had narrowed to a heavily blurred tunnel. She could perceive light shadows and vague shapes, but for her meticulous work, she relied entirely on high-powered tactile magnifiers' muscle memory and an incredibly acute sense of hearing. Isla was given absolute clearance to the climate-controlled archives on the subterranean level of the Montgomery Tower. It was a silent, sprawling tomb of history, perfectly suited to a woman who navigated the world through touch and sound. She worked odd hours, preferring the absolute stillness of the night, when the vibrations of the subway trains and city traffic died down. It was a Tuesday in late November when Alistair's control finally slipped. He had been fasting for a month, a dangerous ascetic practice he used to try and starve his power into submission. But the hunger was an animal, and the animal was thrashing against the bars of his ribcage. A wave of agonizing pain hit him in his private elevator, sending him crashing to his knees. The electronics in the elevator panel sparked and died as the temperature plummeted. The bleeding frost was leaking from him. The elevator, completely short-circuited by his chaotic energy, initiated an emergency lockdown protocol and plummeted downward, bypassing his penthouse floors and crashing to a halt at the lowest point of the building, the subterranean archives. The doors forced themselves open with a screech of warping metal. Frost began to spiderweb across the concrete floor the moment Alistair dragged himself out. He was gasping, clutching his chest. He could feel the aura of death expanding from his body, a 50-foot dome of absolute sub-zero annihilation. The fluorescent lights overhead popped raining down sparks that froze before they hit the ground. He was going to destroy everything. He just needed to find a corner to isolate himself until the violent surge passed. Then he heard the scrape of a chair. "Alex, is that you?" The voice came from the center of the archive. It was a woman's voice, soft, melodic, with a faint musical cadence that cut through the agonizing roar in Alistair's mind. Alistair froze, terror seizing his unbeating heart. A human! There was a human in his kill radius. "Get out!" Alistair roared, but the sound was choked, warped by the freezing air. The frost was rapidly advancing across the floor, creeping up the wooden legs of the massive oak tables. He could see her silhouette through the gloom, a small woman sitting surrounded by ancient parchments. She wasn't running. She wasn't screaming. Isla turned her head, her unfocused eyes straining toward the darkness. She felt the unnatural biting cold slicing through the room, but she couldn't see the monster bleeding ice into the air. What she heard wasn't a monster. She heard the ragged, desperate breathing of a man in profound, physical agony. "You're not Alex," she said, her voice remaining impossibly steady. She stood up slowly, her hands resting on the edge of the table to ground herself. "You're hurt. You're breathing much too fast. You're hyperventilating." I said, "Run." Alistair backed away, but the frost expanded with his panic. The edges of the table she was touching began to crystallize. In seconds, the freezing energy would touch her skin, stop her heart, and turn her to dust. "I can't exactly run," Isla said, her tone carrying a gentle, almost chiding warmth. "I can't see the exit in the dark, and even if I could, I wouldn't leave someone having a panic attack alone in the basement." Alistair braced himself against a concrete pillar, waiting for the inevitable sound of her dying gasp. But it didn't come. "Listen to me," Isla commanded softly. Her voice dropped an octave, striking a resonant, rhythmic frequency. "I want you to match my breathing. Just listen to the sound of my voice. Deep breath in." She exaggerated her own inhalation, filling the silent room with the sound of her breath. "And let it out." Alistair was paralyzed. No one had spoken to him like this in 300 years. No one had dared command the Vampire King, but the pure, unadulterated empathy in her tone, the absolute lack of fear, acted like a circuit breaker in his mind. The monstrous, thrashing animal inside him paused, captivated by the sound. "That's it," she murmured into the dark, stepping slightly away from the table. "You're safe. Just focus on the sound of my words. Nothing else matters. Just the rhythm." Alistair unconsciously drew in a breath, mimicking her cadence. As he did, a miracle occurred. The agonizing pressure in his chest began to recede. The frost, which had been millimeters from Isla's fingertips, halted. The oppressive, freezing death aura surrounding him began to shrink, pulling back into his skin. The temperature in the room slowly neutralized. He stared at her from the shadows, utterly bewildered. For a century, no medicine, no magic, no amount of willpower had been able to stop the bleeding frost once it started. But this human, this fragile, blind woman, had walked him back from the edge of a massacre with nothing but the timbre of her voice. "Better?" she asked softly, tilting her head. "Yes," Alistair whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in an eternity. "Yes, I am better." In the days that followed, Alistair Montgomery became a ghost, haunting his own basement. The encounter in the archives had fundamentally altered him. The oppressive, crushing weight of his power, the constant ticking time bomb in his chest, felt dormant. As long as he could remember the cadence of Isla Harrington's voice, the ice in his veins remained melted. He reviewed the security footage of that night 100 times, watching from multiple angles as she calmly stood her ground while his deadly aura threatened to consume her. He demanded Alex bring him her complete file. When Alex explained her blindness, it felt like a heavy, poetic irony. The only person in the world who wasn't terrified of the monster couldn't even see him. He began to visit her, always at night, always keeping to the shadows. At first, he introduced himself simply as Al, an insomniac executive working in the upper floors who occasionally needed a break from the corporate grind. Isla, utterly oblivious to the supernatural hierarchy of the city, welcomed the company. She was isolated in her own way, trapped by her failing vision and her hyperfixation on the ancient texts. Their nightly meetings became a ritual. Alistair would sit in a plush leather armchair in the corner of the dimly lit archive, while Isla worked under the glow of her specialized magnifying lamps. They talked about history, philosophy, and the crumbling empires documented in the grimoires she was restoring. But mostly, he just listened to her. "You're very quiet tonight, Al," Isla noted one evening, carefully sweeping a soft, bristled brush over a 16th century manuscript. "Is the boardroom treating you poorly?" "Just the usual burdens of management," Alistair murmured, closing his eyes. The room was perfectly temperate. His power was a quiet hum beneath his skin, subdued entirely by her presence. "Will you read to me whatever you're translating?" Isla smiled, a gentle, radiant expression that made Alistair's dormant heart ache. "It's a bit dry. A ledger from a French nobleman complaining about the wheat harvest. Please, just read." As she read, translating the archaic French into smooth, melodic English, Alistair felt a terrifying realization wash over him. He wasn't just using her as a remedy for his curse. He was falling in love with her. He was enamored by her resilience, her sharp wit, and the way she found beauty in a world she could barely see. But Alex Penhaligon saw the danger. One evening before Alistair could make his descent to the archives, Alex intercepted him in the penthouse. The younger vampire's face was a mask of grim concern. "You are playing a suicidal game, Alistair," Alex warned, blocking the elevator doors. "I have turned a blind eye to your nocturnal visits, but this has to stop. You know the history." "Step aside, Alex," Alistair said, his voice laced with the heavy, commanding timbre of the king. The air in the penthouse instantly dropped 10 degrees. "I will not." Alex stood firm, though his breath plumed white in the sudden cold. "Have you forgotten, Catherine? The last time you tethered your humanity to a mortal. It worked for a time. But mortals are fragile, Alistair. They age, they break. And when your power realizes it is being suppressed by a psychological crutch, it will lash out. You will end up freezing that archivist to death, just as you did Catherine." Alistair violently grabbed Alex by the lapels of his suit, slamming him against the steel doors of the elevator. The metal dented inward under the force. "Do not speak her name." Alistair hissed, his eyes bleeding from dark brown to a terrifying luminescent crimson. "Isla is different. She is grounding me. She is a temporary dam holding back an ocean." Alex choked out, refusing to break eye contact. "And the dam is going to break. Cut ties now before you are forced to watch her die." Alistair dropped Alex, turning away, disgust at himself, warring with his desperate need. Alex was right. He was a walking plague, and by lingering near Isla, he was making her a target not just of his own volatile magic, but of his enemies. And his enemies were already circling. Alistair's long absence from the public eye of the underworld had bred rumors of weakness. A rival faction from Chicago, led by a ruthless, ambitious vampire named Dominic, had been probing the edges of the Montgomery territory. Dominic believed the king was dying, and he wanted the throne. Unable to penetrate the heavy security of the penthouse, Dominic's spies had discovered a weakness in the Foundation, the nightly, unguarded visits Alistair made to the subterranean archives. 2 nights later, the inevitable happened. Alistair was pacing his penthouse, forcing himself to stay away from the archives, trying to heed Alex's warning. The agony in his chest was returning, the frost creeping up his forearms. He was in the middle of a brutal internal battle when the tower's localized wards screamed in his mind. The supernatural perimeter of the basement had been breached. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized him. The elevator was too slow. Alistair ripped the reinforced steel doors of the elevator shaft open with his bare hands and threw himself into the abyss, plummeting 60 stories in freefall, before gripping the cables to slow his descent just above the sub-basement level. He tore through the archive doors his entrance, accompanied by a blast of sub-zero wind. The scene before him made his blood run cold, literally. 2 of Dominic's assassins, heavily armed mercenaries, turned by the Chicago Coven, were in the room. One was tearing through the ancient texts looking for the Foundation's secrets. The other had Isla. The vampire had her pinned against the heavy oak table, one hand gripping her throat, lifting her toes off the ground. Isla was gasping her hands, desperately clawing at the unnatural strength of her attacker. "Well, well," the assassin sneered, turning his red eyes toward the door. "Dominic said we'd find the king hiding in the basement. You look terrible, Alistair." The sight of Isla suffocating her face, pale, snapped the last remaining thread of Alistair's control. The bleeding frost did not just leak this time. It exploded. With a roar that shook the foundation of the skyscraper, Alistair released a century of suppressed, agonizing power. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly to 70 degrees below zero. The heavy wooden shelves cracked down the middle. The glass displays shattered into microscopic dust. The moisture in the air instantly turned to falling snow. The assassin, tearing through the books, didn't even have time to scream. The sheer force of the cold flash froze him where he stood. His skin turned grey, then crystalline, before his entire body collapsed into a pile of shattered icy ash. The assassin holding Isla dropped her in shock, turning to run, but he was too late. Alistair moved faster than the eye could track. He seized the vampire by the skull. The transfer of lethal cold was instantaneous. The assassin's eyes widened in horror before freezing solid in their sockets. Alistair crushed his skull like brittle glass, tossing the remains aside. The threat was neutralized, but the nightmare had just begun. Alistair had opened the floodgates, and he couldn't close them. The terrifying, deadly aura was spiraling out of control. The frost was rapidly expanding outward, consuming the room. He looked down and saw Isla collapsed on the floor, shivering violently, her breath coming in ragged, visible puffs of white fog. The edges of her coat were already crystallizing. His power was going to kill her. "Isla." Alistair cried out, his voice monstrous, echoing with the sound of cracking ice. He couldn't touch her. If he touched her with this energy, she would shatter. He fell to his knees on the freezing concrete, clutching his head, screaming in agony as he tried to pull the magic back, trying to bottle the ocean. It was useless. The cold was agonizing, a physical manifestation of his self-hatred and fear. "Please." Alistair begged not to whatever gods were listening, but to the fragile, blind woman trembling on the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for the sound of her final breath, knowing he was the monster who had brought it. "Please, Isla, say something. Please stop me." Isla, fighting through the agonizing cold, dragged herself across the freezing floor. She couldn't see the monstrous form he had taken, only the terrifying drop in temperature and the sounds of unnatural death. But she heard the desperate, broken sob of the man she knew as Al. She reached out into the freezing dark. Her numb fingers found the lapel of his coat. "Al," she whispered, her voice shaking but retaining that same impossible melodic warmth. "Al, look at me. It's okay. I'm right here. Just listen to my voice." For years, the Vampire King had feared his own power, reigning in absolute terror of the monster inside him. But as her soft voice cut through the freezing maelstrom, demanding his attention, the King of the Shadows remained on his knees, utterly submissive to the sound of her whisper. The agonizing winter died in Alistair's throat. As Isla's freezing fingers gripped his lapel, The catastrophic storm of the bleeding frost collapsed inward, snapping back into his core like a retracted whip. The temperature in the subterranean archive surged upwards, stabilizing in seconds. Alistair caught her as she collapsed, wrapping her in his heavy cashmere coat. He bypassed the ruined elevator, carrying her up 60 flights of stairs in a blur of supernatural speed, bursting into his penthouse's private medical suite. Alex Penhaligon was already there, flanked by a trauma surgeon who discreetly serviced the supernatural elite. "You exposed her," Alex hissed, his fangs dropping as he looked at Isla's frostbitten skin. Dominic's men bypassed the wards because they didn't use magic. They used ex-military contractors from Constellis, human mercenaries paid through a shell corporation nested in Coots & Co. They came for the grimoire, Alistair, and they found your weakness. Isla awoke hours later, wrapped in thermal blankets, the sharp scent of antiseptic replacing the dusty comfort of the archives. She couldn't see the opulent vaulted ceilings of the Montgomery penthouse, but she could hear the hushed, frantic arguments outside her door. She heard the name Alistair Montgomery and the terrifying word vampire, spoken not as a myth, but as a tactical problem. When Alistair finally entered, the silence between them was heavy. "You're not an insomniac executive named Al." Isla said, her voice raspy but firm. "You're Alistair Montgomery, and according to the very stressed British man outside, you are something else entirely." Alistair stood by the window, looking out over the glittering expanse of Manhattan. "I am a monster, Isla. The things you heard in the basement, the shattering the cold. That was me. It is a sickness, a curse of my bloodline. I drain the heat and life from everything around me when I lose control. I almost killed you." "But you didn't," she replied, sitting up, ignoring the ache in her joints. "You stopped. When I touched you, you stopped." "It is a temporary reprieve," Alistair said, his voice laced with bitter resignation. He turned to face her, though she could only perceive him as a dark silhouette against the window's glare. "Dominic the vampire who sent those men knows you are the key to my restraint. He will not stop until you are dead, because your death will trigger a cataclysmic grief that will consume me and destroy my empire. I have already arranged for a private jet to take you to a secure estate in Zurich. You will be protected, but you must leave tonight." Isla shook her head. "I'm not going to Zurich. Before your guests interrupted me, I finished translating the 16th century French ledger." It wasn't a ledger, Alistair. The author used a cryptographic cipher developed by the House of Valois to hide its true meaning. It is a medical journal. The author documented the exact symptoms you have. The bleeding frost. Alistair froze. "That's impossible. Every record was destroyed in the Parisian fires." "Not this one." Isla countered her tone, shifting into the sharp, analytical cadence of a scholar. "And it is not a disease, Alistair. It is a defense mechanism. The text states that the freezing aura is a manifestation of an unbonded king, a ruler who has completely isolated himself from his subjects and his humanity. The power overflows because it has no conduit, no anchor. The author theorized that the frost isn't meant to kill. It is meant to protect the king while he is vulnerable, but without an emotional tether, it becomes a permanent destructive state." Before Alistair could process this revelation, the penthouse shook violently. The heavy bulletproof glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows cracked a sound like a gunshot echoing through the suite. Alex burst into the room, his immaculate suit torn, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. "Dominic isn't waiting. He is here. He brought a dozen rogue fledglings and heavily armed tactical teams. They are breaching the lobby and coming up the exterior glass." "Get her to the helipad," Alistair commanded, the terrifying, familiar cold beginning to prickle at the edges of his vision. The fear returned, not for himself, but for Isla. If he fought Dominic here, The bleeding frost would destroy the entire top floor, taking Isla with it. "I'm not leaving," Isla shouted, throwing off the thermal blankets. "Alistair, if you fight them with fear, the frost will consume you. The journal said the power requires absolute surrender to an anchor. You have to let the magic flow through a bond, not suppress it." The heavy steel doors of the medical suite were blown inward by a concussive charge. Smoke poured into the room, followed by the silhouettes of heavily armed mercenaries and the terrifying red-eyed forms of Dominic's vampires. Dominic stepped through the wreckage. He was tall, dressed in impeccable bespoke armor, his fangs bared in a triumphant sneer. The great Alistair Montgomery, hiding in a hospital bed with a blind human pet. How far the king has fallen. Alistair stepped between Isla and the doorway. The temperature in the room was plummeting rapidly. The monitors beeped wildly before their screens cracked from the cold. The bleeding frost was tearing its way to the surface, fueled by his desperate need to protect the woman behind him. The air began to shimmer with deadly microscopic ice crystals. "Dominic." Alistair's voice was barely human, layered with the grinding sound of shifting glaciers. "Leave her. This is between you and me. She is the reason you are weak." Dominic laughed, signaling his men to advance. "Kill the girl. Leave the king to me." Two vampires lunged forward, moving with blinding speed. "Alistair, no!" Isla cried out. She didn't run. Instead, she stepped forward, reaching out blindly until her hands found his broad shoulders. She pressed her face against his back. "Do not push it away. Do not fear it. Let me anchor you." As her hands touched him, the agonizing pain in Alistair's chest shifted. For a century, he had tried to cage the beast, fighting a war of attrition against his own nature. He had feared his crown, but with Isla's heartbeat pressing against his spine, he realized the truth of the ancient text. The power wasn't a disease, it was an extension of his will. He didn't need to suppress it, he needed to direct it. He stopped fighting the frost. He surrendered to it, but instead of letting it explode indiscriminately in a wave of panicked terror, he pulled the energy through his core, filtering it through the profound, overwhelming love he felt for the mortal woman holding on to him. The chaotic 50-foot dome of death did not materialize. Instead, Alistair's eyes erupted in a blinding, terrifyingly beautiful shade of icy blue. He raised a single hand. The ambient temperature in the room remained perfectly stable for Isla Alex and Alistair himself, but a concentrated hyperpressurized beam of absolute zero shot from Alistair's palm, striking the two advancing vampires. They didn't even have time to register the shift in physics. They were flash-frozen mid-leap, turning into flawless statues of solid ice before crashing to the floor and shattering into thousands of harmless, glittering pieces. Dominic's smug expression dissolved into pure, unadulterated horror. The rumors were wrong. The king wasn't dying. The king had simply been asleep. Alistair moved. He was no longer a frantic animal trying to escape a cage. He was a precision instrument of death. He flowed through the room, his movements graceful and lethal. He didn't need to touch Dominic's mercenaries. He merely exhaled, sending localized targeted bursts of sub-zero wind that froze their weapons solid, shattering their assault rifles like brittle glass. Dominic turned to flee, his bravado entirely broken, but Alistair was already in front of him, blocking the ruined doorway. "You sought a crown you could never bear," Alistair whispered, his voice smooth, commanding, and infinitely cold. He placed 2 fingers against Dominic's forehead. The Chicago vampire gasped as the localized frost invaded his veins, turning his blood to sludge and then to solid ice. Within seconds, Dominic collapsed, a lifeless, frozen monument to his own hubris. The remaining mercenaries dropped their shattered weapons and fled, scrambling over each other to escape the penthouse. Silence descended upon the ruined medical suite. The threat was eradicated. Alistair stood among the shattered ice, his breathing steady. The destructive wild aura was gone. His power hummed beneath his skin, a tamed, controlled force. He turned around to face Isla. She was standing amidst the wreckage, her sightless eyes facing his direction. She looked small, fragile, and utterly fearless. Slowly the king of the North American factions, a predator who had brought an entire rival coven to its knees without breaking a sweat, walked across the room. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, Alistair Montgomery dropped to his knees on the floor, covered in frost and shattered glass, bowing his head before her. "You have saved my life, Isla Harrington," Alistair said, his voice stripped of all monstrous echoes, carrying only deep, unwavering reverence. "You saved my soul. I have spent 100 years terrified of the dark. I will never fear it again, so long as you are my light." Isla smiled, reaching out until her fingers found the soft, warm hair at the nape of his neck. She gently tilted his head up. "Then it is a good thing I prefer the night shift, Alistair." The curse of the bleeding frost was finally broken, not by medicine and not by magic, but by the quiet courage of a woman who taught the most dangerous monster in the world how to simply breathe again. The Montgomery Empire would rebuild, and the king would rule once more, but he would never again sit upon his throne alone. The shadows of Manhattan were no longer a prison for a cursed immortal. They were a sanctuary overseen by a king who had finally found his queen. Did the Vampire King's frozen heart and Isla's fearless spirit leave you completely captivated? If you loved this dark, romantic tale of power, surrender, and ultimate devotion, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who crave supernatural drama, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding, original romances. Stay tuned for our next epic love story.